and then let Dr. Gleb take it from there. So Dr. Gleb is an internationally renowned thought leader in emotional and social intelligence, decision making, and risk management. His specialty is helping forward looking leaders who are concerned about resistance to change. He serves as the CEO of the boutique consulting and training company Disaster Avoidance Experts. Its methodology transforms negative emotions and resistance to change into positive emotions and commitment by fusing narratives, nudges, and neuroscience. Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, major nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavioral scientist with 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State University. To help you take advantage of his expertise, I've asked him to come share with us about defeating cognitive biases to improve quality.
All right. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dan, and welcome everyone. This is definitely an unusual way to hold a awards dinner, but we've had to do a lot of unusual things in the pandemic. And one of the unusual things we'll talk about is how do you defeat cognitive biases to improve quality? Because cognitive biases are kind of an unusual topic to discuss in quality professional circles. Focus more on how do you ensure quality, various processes, tasks, not on the more cognitive aspects of how we think, how we manage risks, and how we make decisions. And this is what we'll be talking about today, but it's very important to ensure good quality for you to manage risks effectively and make good decisions. And for that, you need to address the way that our minds, unfortunately, don't make good decisions intuitively, the way that we take risks badly. Of course, there's lots of these examples in the pandemic itself, but of course, in many other areas. I mean, we've seen, for example, Boeing, right? Before the pandemic, the horrible quality disaster of the 737 MAX, where 346 people were killed due to the 2 crashes of the 737 MAX, and where over $25 billion in value, 25 billion was wiped out from Boeing's valuation even before the pandemic due to the 737 MAX disaster. And that's due to, of course, fundamentally a problem of quality, having bad quality. So those are the kinds of mistakes that people tend to make even at the highest level with so much money and resources like Boeing. It doesn't get much higher quality in terms of resources, money than Boeing, but they still made a terrible mistake. And there are reasons why we make these mistakes. And that's what the research in behavioral science has shown. I'm a behavioral scientist. I've been researching this for over 15 years in academia, as Dan mentioned, and I've also been training, consulting, coaching folks on this topic for about all that time and even longer because I left academia a couple of years ago and I've been doing consulting, coaching, and training full time. So that's where I'm coming from. So let's talk a little bit about these cognitive biases. And I'll start with something that you've probably heard a lot of folks talk about is confidence. Being confident, how important it is to be confident. This is indeed important. It's important to be confident in your decisions, in your way that you are in the world, whether in the workplace to ensure quality and in other areas of life to, for example, driving. ASQ Harrisburg is a place you really need to drive to get to anywhere, and I'm sure all of you are quite capable drivers. So how good are your driving skills? You'll see a poll right now where you will be able to answer how good are your driving skills? Are you in the bottom half of drivers or in the top half of drivers? Are you below average in your driving skills or above average in your driving skills? So please vote on whether you're in the top half or the bottom half of drivers. And for those who've never used the poll feature, you're just going to be able to see a poll on your screen. You just click on that on Zoom. All right, 5 more seconds. I see that about 90% of the people voted. All right, so we can see from the results that of the overwhelming amount of people here are above average in their driving skills. Now, when you see these results, you're going to be asking yourself, well, how come we have 85% of the people who are above average and 50% of the people who are below average? Shouldn't it be 50% above average and 50% below average? That is a tendency that we as human beings have, to be overconfident in our abilities. The same question was asked in a research study of college students, and they indicated 94% of them indicated that they were above average drivers, despite having much less experience in driving than all of you do. So this is an example of how we tend to be overconfident, even in the quality sector. And of course, when we researched, found out what happened with Boeing, overconfidence was a huge problem in what led to their quality disaster. They had lots of information internally that 737 MAX was badly flawed. They had emails, internal emails from the testing pilots saying that this is a plane designed by monkeys, supervised by clowns, which is not information you want to hear. But the Boeing leadership ignored that. They were confident in their ability. All of their previous planes that they made, the newer models, were safer than the old models, and they felt that it would be impossible for the new model to be less safe than the older models. So they felt that the 737 MAX, their newest model, would be safer, at least as safe as the previous model. And of course, it would save money. And that's why they released it, and that's why the bad results happened. Now, overconfidence bias is the name for this tendency, this overconfidence. And that's what it refers to. This is one of these dangerous cognitive biases. It's a tendency to be way too confident. Another study showed that when people say they're 100% confident, as the Boeing leadership was on the 737 MAX, they're only right 80% of the time. And you don't want to spin that roulette when you are launching a major thing like the 737 MAX or another major project. You don't want to be 100% confident and be right only 80% of the time. That means you're going to lose. You bet the company, essentially, you're going to lose the company a fifth of the time. Bet the house, you're going to lose the fifth of the time. No wonder Vegas makes good money. It's especially dangerous for those with more experience and authority, including in the quality sector. So the more experience and authority you have, the more you trust your own judgment. And unfortunately, trusting your own judgment leads to some pretty big problems, as we saw with Boeing and many other quality disasters that we can talk about. The trust in your expertise, in your experience and authority comes when you're facing new situations, especially new situations, and you're not realizing that your previous expertise, your previous experience, your existing authority are not good for this current situation, as we've seen so often with the pandemic, that so many folks made bad decisions around the pandemic because they felt that they had their ability to make good decisions, and they actually failed quite badly. So let's talk a little bit about what happens. Why do we have these tendencies to be too confident and other cognitive biases that we'll get to? Well, we are given the advice that we should go with our gut. Gurus, prominent gurus in all areas tell us to go with your gut, trust your intuition, follow your heart, and so on. It feels good to go with our gut, with our heart, and trust our intuition. It feels comfortable. It feels safe. Unfortunately, it often leads to disasters when we do so, because our gut is evolved for the ancient savannah, not the modern world. So the gut reactions, for example, the biggest response to threats that we have is the fight or flight response. Do we attack aggressively, fight, or do we withdraw defensively? And that's very often what you'll see people doing in the decision-making process. Either they go toward whatever initiative is proposed, or they withdraw from it, rather than step back, not make a snap judgment, withhold their judgment, evaluate the data, and then make a quality decision based on the data. But what really often happens in organizations is that people pre-make the decision. They say yes or no to themselves internally, immediately or pretty immediately upon pondering a decision, and then they find data to support their perspective, which is a terrible way to go. but that's what really happens very often in organizations. And this is all the result of dangerous judgment errors, like the overconfidence bias. This is one of many dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. You might have heard of them before. Confirmation bias is probably the most popular, well-known one, where you look for information that confirms your beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. So that's a pretty bad one. And overconfidence bias, I've seen it be probably the biggest problem for in quality circles, being too confident of their own expertise, experience, and authority. And I've been by the way, presenting for quality professionals for a long time already, did a lot of presentations, and I'm one of the frequent contributing authors to Quality Digest, a premier publication in the quality field. So I know what I'm talking about with quality audiences. It comes from our evolutionary background, these cognitive biases, as I mentioned, and just the structure of our brain, the way that we process information. Not going to go into it here, but that's what causes these dangerous judgment errors. I'm going to ask you to do another poll at this stage. Were you ever confident that a decision was right and you turned out to be wrong? I remember that happened to me when I was hiring an assistant manager. So I felt that she would be good. I was promoting her from the ranks, and she's been a great worker in the ranks. She did a really great job. But when she got promoted to assistant manager, she turned out to not be doing a very good job. She was very micromanaging. She was trying to, get everyone to do what she felt was the right way to do things. And that really hurt the organization. So I made a bad decision and I had to let her go. And that was something that I really regretted. So that's an example. And then, by the way, I run a training and consulting and coaching company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, which is a future-proofing consultancy focusing on addressing threats and opportunities and addressing resistance to change. So that's the context. Okay, I'll give you 5 more seconds to vote. So that's about 70% of the people voted. So make your voice heard. All right. So we see that happened, pretty much what I was describing, feeling very confident that you were right and turning out to be wrong to almost everyone. There's one person for whom it didn't happen. I'm glad for you, however, it didn't happen. But the vast majority of you, 97%, that happened to. So this is pretty frequent experience. And that's the experience, that's the feeling of cognitive bias coming into play. All right, so let's talk about how do we identify these cognitive biases. Well, there's an assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, which I'll send to you after the presentation so you can have it and use it. It focuses on the 30 most dangerous judgment errors in professional settings, including for quality. It evaluates their extent and impact in your workplace and gives you the next steps to address these challenges. So at this point, I'd like you to bring up the chat feature. We'll be using it for the next part of the presentation. So bring up the chat feature on Zoom. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. So I'm screen sharing. And here are the directions for the questionnaire. Each question refers to a problem, a typical problem that might happen in a professional setting. It doesn't talk about overconfidence bias as a concept. It talks about the feeling of it, what happens, specific behaviors that without knowing cognitive biases, you could easily take the assessment. And your goal, whoever is taking the assessment, is to indicate how often a certain problem occurred in the past year as a percentage. Don't overthink it. You should really go with your initial impression. It doesn't have to be absolutely precise. Each question should take you 10, 15, 20 seconds at most. So let's take a look at the first question. What percentage of projects in your company missed a deadline or went over budget? Or if you don't know your whole company, within the department where you're working, within your team. So percentage of projects, use the chat to input the percentage of projects, 50%, 20%, 80%. So 50%. So remember to don't use direct messaging. Please send it to everyone. All right, so we have 50%, 60%. Emily said 80%. Colleen said 75%. Marianne, 85%. Cindy said 50%, Robert says 15%, Duke says 0%, Sally 40%, Bill says 80%, Jamie says 60%. So we see a wide range. So Sandy says 0%, Laura says 20%. And what you'll tend to see is this question gets a wide range of responses. If this is about a dangerous judgment error called the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy. When we make plans, when organizations make plans, they feel that things will go according to plan, that we make a plan, we implement it, things are going to be fine. Well, that's not how reality works. People have this phrase, and they use this phrase in quality circles, that failing to plan is planning to fail. Failing to plan is planning to fail. You've probably heard that phrase. Unfortunately, that's a misleading phrase, because the reality is when you make a plan, you feel that it will go right, and you don't address problems. A much more effective approach that I'll talk about, a technique to use it, is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. So failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. That's a much more effective approach. And so you need to plan for problems rather than just make one plan and hope everything will go fine. Number 2, what percentage of team conflicts occurred because someone overestimated the effectiveness of their communication skills and persuasiveness? So think about team conflicts, however many occurred, regularly, 20 over the last year, 50, 80. What percent of them occurred because someone overestimated how effective they are in their communication skills and persuasiveness? So we see 80 from 10, Sandy says 75, Gar says 50, Duke 40, Cindy says 30, Emily 15%, Robert less than 5%, Merle 50%, Sally 30%, John 30%, Chad 5%, Marianne 20, Danielle 20, Bill 75%, Bill Moore 75%, Bill Gordon 25%. Dan says he talks too much. Fair enough, Dan. Well, you know yourself. So 80% from Dan, Laura 50%. So this is a cognitive bias called the illusion of transparency. When we communicate, we inherently feel that we're sending our message effectively 100% to the other person, and the other person is 100% receiving it and internalizing it and accepting it. That's not what actually happens, unfortunately. In this modern age of Zoom, we have technical glitches all the time where you start your conversation by saying, Mike, you're on mute, or Mary, unmute yourself, or something like that. And there's lots of technical glitches, lots of things that you don't hear where the other person thinks you're hearing them, and vice versa, where you think the other person is hearing you and they're not actually hearing you. So technical glitches can happen. Attention glitches can happen where you might be talking to someone in a virtual meeting and they're typing away on their email in the background or checking their messages on the phone. That can also happen in person. They can be distracted by their phone. They can be thinking about an important meeting that's coming up. They can be thinking about what they'll have for lunch. So that happens. And of course, they can be suffering from confirmation bias and other biases. They're filters, essentially, which cause them to interpret your words, as fitting their own preconceptions. So that's something that very often happens where, let's say you're talking about a project and you're highlighting, both here are the opportunities and here are the problems. And if this is someone who inherently backs the project, they're only going to be looking for the opportunities and rewards, ignoring any problems, any cons with the project. Happens all the time. Number 3, of all significant decisions, in what percentage of cases was someone overconfident about their decision? Of course, this is about the overconfidence bias. So significant decisions, person who was overconfident, someone, not necessarily you, someone on the team was overconfident about the decision-making process. So 15%, 25%, 30%, Marl says 60%, Sandy says 30%, John says 50%, 20%, Bill Gordon 10%, Dan 90%, Jamie 40%, Chad 10%, Dan 60%. So here, this is of course about the overconfidence bias. Good. So as you can see, different people have different percentages for various questions, for various challenges, and that refers to organizations. Different organizations have different problems, and you want to figure out which of these cognitive biases are the biggest problem for your organizations. If you're at the 10 to 20% range, it's not that big a deal. It can be a little bit challenging, maybe a bit of a problem, but not that big a deal. If you're in the 20 to 30% range, that becomes more of a moderate problem on any of these cognitive biases. And when you're in the 40 and above percent range, that becomes a serious problem. If you're overconfident, then like Boeing, you will eventually make a serious error. The percentage of team conflicts that result from these things that result in bad decisions being made and people eventually leaving the organizations. Missing the deadline or going over budget, I mean, this is obvious. You're misallocating resources, not using them effectively. So the rest of the questions, I will send you the assessment. You can go through it on your own. They mirror these types of questions where you get to figure out what are the biggest problems in your company. And then the rest of the assessment goes through how do you assess your organization more broadly and what steps you can take to address these dangerous judgment errors. It's very useful to have your whole team take the assessment as well as having you take the assessment. So let's take a look at the assessment and a poll on the assessment. Do you think it would help improve the quality for your team to take the assessment and address the cognitive biases that are uncovered by the assessment? Please go ahead and vote. So I see 72% of the people voted. Let's give folks 5 more seconds to make their voice heard. All right. Great. So we see that for 10%, folks don't think that this won't help them. That's great. So you don't need to worry about it. For those who do, the 90% overwhelming majority, Dan says ego will get in the way of learning. Well, this is the way that you reveal ego questions. And that is really important for you to understand that this is a way of revealing. Then you discuss the questions. Why do people get different answers and so on? It's very valuable to take the assessment if you actually want to address these cognitive biases. But if you're some of the people who are not interested in addressing these cognitive biases, don't worry about it. For those who are interested, I'll send you the assessment afterward. So you'll want to take it yourself first of all. And then if you believe it helps your team, then make sure to bring it to your team and advise them to take the assessment, talk about your experience, and go forward to bring this information to them. All right. So this is a technique to address figuring out what are the dangerous judgment errors. Emily asked, yeah, you can ask a quick question. I'll take more thorough questions at the end, but yes, if it's a quick question, please go ahead, Emily.
Yes, I had a question on the assessment.
Yeah.
If you are only able to have your team take that assessment and not the rest of the company, will that help to address issues within the decision-making skills of projects that the
course.
team is involved in that they may not have
Absolutely.
control over?
Absolutely, of course, because then they understand what cognitive biases are happening within them. That's, awareness internally is the first step. So you have awareness internally, what's going on within your team and the things that your team can control, and then your team can influence others. If they can say, aha, this is what's going on here, then they can take steps to address these patterns that they see that are happening in other projects that your team is not controlling directly.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Emily. Let's talk about techniques to, once you find out about these cognitive biases, and even without finding out about them, you can use these 2 techniques to address these cognitive biases. So you don't need to know all the cognitive biases before going into these techniques, and they automatically address a number of cognitive biases. Of course, it helps a lot to take the assessment, but separately, these techniques will help anyway address these cognitive biases. So 2 techniques. One is a quick technique for daily decision-making on any decisions that you don't want to screw up. But once you have a little bit of practice with it, it will only take 2 minutes to go through it. It's 5 questions to avoid decision disasters. First question, What important information didn't I yet fully consider? So what evidence did you take into account? There are two parts to this question. The information you didn't consider, that addresses the confirmation bias and many other similar cognitive biases, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs, ignore information that doesn't. So look twice as hard for information that goes against your beliefs, and orient toward information that, to judging information that confirms your beliefs more harshly. That's the first part. Second, important information. You don't want to get stuck in analysis paralysis. So depending on the importance of the decision, you want to consider more or less information. This is a huge decision. You want to gather more information and consider a wider range of information important. If it's a smaller, less important decision, how to spend a few $1,000s, then you don't want to spend too much time on this and get into analysis paralysis. So decide in advance how important, what information is important for each decision. Then what dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet address? Of course, going through the assessment is the best way to learn about the dangerous judgment errors. It has a section on the back about the specific dangerous judgment errors that each question refers to, and will help you learn which of these dangerous judgment errors are the most relevant for your organization. Then what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about other folks in your ASQ Harrisburg group. What would they tell you to do? Maybe some board members, some mentors that you have, a trusted coach or consultant. What would they tell you to do in this situation? You get about 50% of the benefit from this question just by asking it. It's called getting an external perspective. It's a very useful technique in debiasing, which is the practice of fighting these biases. And of course, you get the other 50% of the benefit by calling this person, or if you're a millennial, texting this person. How have I addressed all the ways this could fail? This is a crucial question. We often think about all the ways that a project can succeed and don't think about all the ways it can fail. So think about all the ways it can fail. Imagine it completely failed, and then how would you address these failures? And that's going to be very useful for you as you go forward. Finally, what new information would cause me to revisit this decision? What would cause you to change your mind? Once we make a decision, it's very hard for us to change our minds. We tend to have this post-decision-making rationalization process. We tend to stick to our decisions. But if you decide in advance, especially as part of a group that you decide in advance, okay, this is information that would make us reconsider the decision, that's going to be very helpful for you. And talking about a group, this technique is not only useful for you as an individual and for your team to do as individuals, it's very helpful for group decision-making processes. So if you have everyone on your team who's part of the decision-making process, answer these questions for themselves before coming to a decision-making meeting, and then structure the agenda of the meeting simply along these 5 questions. It will take you so much less time. I can guarantee that. I've seen people save an average of 60% of time on decision-making meetings by having them answer these questions in advance and then coming to the meeting with their answers and then just talking through them on the agenda. That's a very effective way of making decisions. All right, we'll do another poll similar to the previous one on the 5 questions. Do you think it would help improve quality for you and your team to use this quick method on any decisions you don't want to get wrong, you don't want to screw up? All right, see 75% of the people voted. Let's get 5 more seconds for the last folks to get their votes in. All right, so we see overwhelmingly folks would find it helpful to use this technique. I'm glad to hear it. So I'll send out a decision aid with these 5 questions as part of the resources at the end of the presentation. And you should start using it yourself, definitely, and then share it with your team and encourage them to use it. And that will hopefully propagate it throughout your organization once you start to get your team using it. I've seen quality managers effectively do this by using it themselves and encouraging their team to use it, and then others in the organization start to use it as well. So this is a good way of going forward. Okay, and a bigger technique that I wanted to tell you about, which will address major project failures, major process failures. This is for major serious projects where you already made a decision and you want to implement it correctly. So let's say you use the previous technique or an additional technique to make a decision and you want to implement it correctly. You use the failure proofing technique to make sure that you are not screwing up the implementation process, which you could make a good decision, but if you implement it poorly, then you're not really going to have a good outcome. So the first of 8 steps, you want to gather the relevant stakeholders. And this, you want to include people who are going to have experience and authority. A range of 6 to 10 people. So that's what I recommend. Don't go more than 10 because it really becomes unmanageable at this stage. And you want those leaders with the most expertise and those who have some authority. So don't only have higher up personnel. You want to have some people with expertise on the question at hand. So and of course, you want to have leaders who have the decision-making authority, the budget authority or whatever, however it works in your organization. Strongly consider hiring an independent facilitator. This, you can bring in somebody from your ASQ group. So that would be some board members, so on. You can have someone from the advisory board or the board of directors of your organization, a mentor figure of some sort. You can have someone with trained facilitation skills, a coach, a consultant. So it's really going to be useful to you to hire that person. Next, explain the process. Of course, you want to make sure that people understand what they're doing, the process that they'll go through, and you'll learn about it as I explain it. Explain this and all the process, all the steps so that people get on the same page. Next, develop next best alternatives. Have each participant write down an NBA next best alternative anonymously. Anonymity is really important for this process, and it's one of the reasons it's helpful to have an independent facilitator. Anonymity gives you the ability to write down unpopular opinions and things that might not go very well. So when, for example, I had a project, was working on a project launch, facilitating one as a consultant. So they hired me to facilitate project launch failure proofing process. And one of the things that was written down for a later section of the project that I'll talk about addressing threats was that the project would fail because the newly hired sales VP and the operations VP hated each other's guts. So that was definitely not something that you would be comfortable sharing. It might be a career limiting move if you shared it publicly, but as a result of it being written down anonymously, we were able to discuss it. So that's why you want to ensure that unpopular, politically problematic opinions can be voiced. The facilitator gathers and reads everyone's NBAs and holds a vote to select the top 2 of NBAs among the people, facilitates the discussion, and then you want to take an anonymous vote on whether one of the NBAs is preferable to the original implementation plan. You can also integrate elements of the next best alternative into the implementation plan itself. Then, brainstorm reasons for failures. This is a critical part of the failure proofing technique. Imagine that the decision, project, process definitely failed, absolutely failed. This is important. You don't want to say simply what kind of problems might go wrong, how might it go wrong. You want to say that it definitely failed, absolutely failed. That gives people permission, even supporters of the project, to brainstorm ways that it can actually fail and then collaborate together on making sure that it doesn't. Each participant writes down 3 reasons for failure, anonymously, 3 potential reasons for failure. And then the facilitator gathers everyone's statements, highlights the key themes, don't necessarily need to read everyone's things, and focuses on reasons that wouldn't be typically brought up while ensuring anonymity, of course. Decide on the most likely problems. That's the next step. So you're kind of going into the payoff. How are you going to address these problems? Discuss these reasons, especially ones that are rude, impolitic, or dangerous to careers, like the conflict between the sales VP and operations VP I mentioned. Check for potential cognitive biases. So you already will have the assessment for dangerous judgment errors to do that. Assess anonymously the likelihood of each reason for failure. using percentages, and pay special attention then to ones that are the most harmful, the most likely to have a negative impact on the project and the process. And then brainstorm ways to fix problems. So here you're getting to the real payoff. How can you fix these most problematic issues? Brainstorm ways of solving them together and address potential mental blind spots, so these cognitive biases, ideally using the assessment. Next, you don't want to simply address problems. You want to maximize success. So you want to look for opportunities, how this project can succeed. Imagine it succeeded spectacularly, just wonderful success. Brainstorm ways of achieving this outcome. So you want each participant to write 3 plausible reasons for success, and the facilitator gathers them, highlights key themes, leads the discussion, including the check for cognitive biases, and then brainstorm ways of maximizing each reason for success. So the same process as with failure. Finally, you want to revise the plan based on this new information with the NBAs, the addressing threats and maximizing opportunities, addressing failures, maximizing success. And if needed, the exercise is repeated if you actually do some serious revisions. I recommend going through the exercise again. So this is for major projects, major serious projects that you don't want to screw up the implementation. Take a look at the poll. And would it help improve quality for you and your team if you use the failure proofing technique for major projects? Please go ahead and vote on that. Okay, I see that we have 78% of the people who voted. Let's give 5 more seconds. All right. Great. So we see that overwhelmingly folks would benefit from using this. So that's great. So that you want to then start by bringing this information to your team, and I'll send you a manual on using this technique, which you can share with your team. So you read through it yourself, learn about it, and then share about it with your team and have them start using it. And again, that's a good way of bringing it into the organization. As your team starts using it, you can do that. Of course, you can also send it to the leadership of the organization, encourage them to use it. Same thing for the 5 questions and the assessment. And finally, I promised some additional resources. So these are some free additional resources that you can get if you wish. First, the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace. Next, the decision aid on 5 key questions to avoid decision disasters, a manual on defending your future, and finally, sample chapters from my best-selling book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And in addition to these resources, I'll be happy to do a coaching session for the first 3 people who respond. I have 3 open slots, so it's first come, first serve. I'll send you an email about it, and then you'll just respond, schedule a time if you are one of the first 3 people. All right, so same thing as before. Sandy, you'll get to vote on this in a second. So please go ahead and vote on whether you would like the free postdoc resources. So go ahead and vote. So Sandy, you'll want to put in there that you want the resources. Okay, and while folks vote, I'll be happy to take any questions on the presentation. Still have about up to the hour. Yeah, so we still have quite a bit of, we still have time. So please go ahead. Questions on any aspects of the presentation?
Just one question. Do you find your techniques result in are there times when decision making takes longer with these additional techniques? Is that is that something you find with these approaches, that it takes an investment of more time to have a higher quality decision?
It does in some cases. So when you use the 5 questions technique, what I tend to find is that that actually once people have some practice with it, it's a quicker technique than they previously used, because previously you have to kind of think about all the things and go through it. So that's something that I tend to find actually quickens the decision-making process. So, I should end the poll. So 5 more seconds for people who want to vote on the poll. So that is not something that generally takes more time using the 5 questions method. Using the failure proofing technique generally does take more time. So it definitely is an investment of time. And that's why it's only for major projects and processes where you're making major projects, major decisions that you don't want to screw up and want to make sure that you get right. Does that help, Tom?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, this is Rob. I have a question. For the companies and organizations that you've consulted with and use these techniques, what was the response from the participants after some major decisions were made? How did they feel about the process, and what were the learnings from that?
So from the process, what I tend to find as the first round goes through is that people definitely feel some discomfort, because they have to go against their intuitions. By definition, you feel uncomfortable going against your gut, and you have to start questioning yourself and having more self-awareness of, why do I feel the way I do? Why am I tempted to make this decision? What are, especially when some of the political issues are revealed, like in that the product launch situation, that was definitely an uncomfortable moment, and we had to have a discussion which resulted in addressing some of the issues between the sales VP and operations VP, or how do I say this, mitigating the challenge of their potential conflicts on the launch of the new product. So that was definitely a little bit less comfortable than people are used to, but that's because people are not addressing the elephant in the room. So after the decision-making process, what tends to happen the first time around especially is that people feel some discomfort, some questioning of themselves, and they also feel much more confident about the results of the process that they previously did than their previous decision-making process. Whereas previously, the decision-making generally involved gathering some data, getting people in the room and discussing it. And that's not great for an effective decision-making process, because you tend to fall into a lot of cognitive biases, both when gathering data and especially when discussing the data. So people felt much more confident about the outcome of the process, and they felt much more confident the decision would be a good one, and that whether it's the decision-making process on how to make the decision or how to implement the project. Does that help?
Sorry, I was on mute. Technical difficulty. Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Other folks.
Yeah, this is John Sharp. Hello. Yeah, I probably read every book imaginable from Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Dan Harley, Richard Thaler, and I'll definitely get your book. I'll look it up on Amazon. I'm assuming it's out there, and take a look at it. You know, Nassim Taleb and the Black Swan event.
Absolutely. They're great.
My whole library is about.
So you know that about these cognitive biases. Wonderful. That's great.
Is there any other particular book or author that you have recommended or studied or that you've done research on that you'd recommend?
Sure. I would recommend looking up David McRaney, You're Not So Smart. I don't know if you've checked that.
I have that one. But and I'm actually now to the point I'm rereading all these books that I have in my library. But yeah, you could recommend that one.
Yes, so that I think is good because it's a popularization of the research, and he describes it in a really clear way. You know, Danny Kahneman, he's a wonderful researcher. He's not the best writer, and that's some of the issues I have with some folks who are great researchers but not very great writers. So I think that's going to be. So you know about that. No, I think you're doing pretty well with these books, and of course my book. So check that out. That really focuses. The people you're talking about have been more of the first generation of researchers who focused on discovering these cognitive biases. My generation of researchers, the next one, is focusing on how to address these cognitive biases. What's the practice of debiasing? So this is what the presentation is about, how to address these cognitive biases effectively.
Yep, thank you.
You're very welcome, John. Other folks?
Yes, this is Emily.
Hi, Emily.
What percentage of the time would you say using these techniques improves the outcome? I know not everything's perfect and you'll still have projects fail even with using these techniques, but how much would you say that you've seen it improve outcomes overall?
Yeah, so about 40% of the projects make better decisions and improve outcomes. So that's what I've generally seen, a 40% improvement on average. Let me be clear. Some companies have a smaller improvement, some companies have a larger improvement. So I'm talking about the average improvement. And that's what the research generally bears out. Once you start addressing cognitive biases, that's about the range of improvement you start to get. So 40% improvement on the quality of decisions and outcomes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, Emily.
Yeah, John again. Yeah,
yes.
I have quite a few questions, but I don't want
please go ahead.
Ask too many. But I do. I love the part about the planning failure and fallacy, and I've given some presentations of material on planning for failure. And I'm a defensive pessimist. I don't know if you've ever heard that term.
Yes.
And I'm always looking for people on my team to be defensive pessimists, because they're the ones who question and challenge and a lot of things that you share. They're not just blindly going along with everybody and oh, everything's going to be wonderful and we're going to finish the project on time. We're not going to have any problems. You know, you want people to challenge the system. So I don't know if in any of your research you had anything else on defensive pessimism. And then a lot of the tools on our team, the members on this call would recognize some of those things like process FMEAs, design FMEAs, design reviews, audits, et cetera, are all tools that we would be used to in quality to try to help prevent mistakes from happening. I don't know if you've ever delved into all those specific quality tools.
I did, and there's some of the tools that catch some of these cognitive biases and others don't. So this is, I'm giving a comprehensive tool that catches a lot of these cognitive biases at once. So yes, so that's kind of the first part. About the defensive pessimists, yes, so you can always so call them devil's advocates. That's a useful, definitely want some of them on your team. The research shows you want at least 2 on your team. So 1 is really not sufficient. Their voice will tend to get, in most cases, shut down. So you want at least 2 of these defensive pessimists on your team. You also want the opposite from the point of view of optimism. If your team is mostly defensive pessimists, you want at least 2 optimists on your team. Defensive pessimists are not great at idea generation. They're great at spotting holes in ideas. Optimists, entrepreneurial, creative folks, they're great at generating ideas. And they often come up with half-baked potatoes, which is great because then the defensive optimists can say, okay, you know, these are half-baked potatoes. Maybe these couple of, these 20 ideas are half-baked potatoes. Maybe these 3 are worth finishing baking. And they're great at implementing and addressing all the flaws of the half-baked potatoes and then deciding which ones are worth implementing further. You might have this book already, but check out Wisdom of the Crowds. It talks about, it has a section in the middle specifically about the value of having devil's advocates on your teams and how it improves team decision-making. So that would be a good book. Then the other thing that I would recommend is looking at books, Dan Goleman's book on social intelligence. And why I recommend that book is that defensive pessimists, the one problem, a major challenge that I've seen defensive pessimists run into is being labeled as Mr. No or Mrs. No, and being dismissed because they're not really contributing to the team, they're just slowing things down. Knowing tools from social intelligence, and I talk about that a little bit in my book, how to effectively influence people and persuade them, basic things like you don't want to simply say no, you want to say, hey, this is a great team project, team effort. Let's look for some of the issues that might slow down the team as we go forward. Kind of putting yourself on everyone's side and saying, we're all part of a team, and acting more as a scout that looks out for problems and brings them into a problem-solving circle, rather than just kind of saying, stop, let's not go forward. This is a challenge. So there's a major difference in attitude and a major difference in how you effectively influence and persuade people. So that's something to think about. Other folks, other questions?
Well, Dr. Gleb, it sounds like everyone's kind of asked all their questions. I want to say thank you again from everyone for coming here and speaking with us. Really loved your presentation. Did you provide any contact information as well if people want to?
I'll send those who want their resources, I'll send them by email, so they'll have my contact information.
Excellent. Okay. Just one little bit of logistics here for anyone who needs a receipt for tonight's event for registration units and didn't register through ePly. You'll need to email me that you were here and that you want a receipt. That's at dan@mantech.org, and I'll just throw that in the chat window as well. But other than that, again, Dr. Gleb, thank you. Thank you, Bill, for setting this up for us. I think we skip an event in February, so be on the lookout for the next newsletter and event notification for our March event. And have a good night.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Dan. Have a great day, everyone, and look for resources from me probably tomorrow. All right.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank
You're
you.
very welcome.
Thank you very
was
much.
helpful. You're welcome, Robert. You're welcome, Bill and Duke. Thank you, Sadie. And Chad, thank you. Appreciate that. You're welcome, Matthew. Tom, you're very welcome.